All right, this is working good. Okay. All right, so my name is Matias, and I'm here to talk about how we can hook up Angular with an Express server. And before I start about myself, so I run and operate the blog yearofmoo.com, and I work to make a lot of Angular tutorials, mainly about animations and testing, and there's one on search engine optimization, really in-depth articles about AngularJS. So for anybody who's new to Angular, please take a visit. And for the past year and a half, close to a year and a half, I've worked with the Angular core team developing the framework. And we built the animations driver, we built some Angular Dart stuff, and now we're working on 2.0. So what am I here to talk about? So before I do that, here's a link to the slides for anybody who wants to download those. Just give you a minute. Okay, so the EA and mean. Now we've had some presentations before this one that talked about Express and Node and Mongo, but the A in this case stands for Angular, and that's the front-end aspect of a website that's built with the mean stack. And for the audience here, I'm assuming that you guys have enough web experience to understand how backend works and the front-end works. So I don't have to tell you what a backend and what a front-end is. However, in this case, Express handles the backend and Angular handles the frontend. So, being with the role of the backend, we know that it connects to the database, it talks with Mongo, it delivers data to the user through an API, and it can handle authentication and authorization, right? Simple stuff. And the frontend, in this case, it takes the API data. So, when we talk about an API, what do I mean? Like, what APIs have you guys commonly used? You've probably used the YouTube API, you've probably used the Google Maps API, you made your own API, any other third-party service. So that's what I mean by an API. And Angular on the front end will take that code and mash it together with the HTML template, and you'll get a web page out of that. And in addition to that, it handles user interactivity to make the web page alive. So let's see an example. So in January, I spoke at NGConf, which was the Angular conference, and I talked about an application here which uses the YouTube API to list a bunch of videos that are relevant to Angular. And you can search for other stuff in here, like, for example, funny. It'll list funny videos. Back to Angular. Here's a video from a presenter in Toronto, and so on. And this uses animations. But the point of this is that there's an API somewhere on the internet. Angular can harness that API and display what's on the page. And that's what Express is doing. So how does this differ from a website that was built 10 years ago? Well, 10 years ago I was coding PHP. And I did that for a long time, but the way that I built the websites back then were everything that gets fetched from the database, everything that gets delivered to the user is a single HTML page. But once that gets delivered to the user, then the JavaScript would hook in and it could somehow customize parts of the page. But the difference here is that whatever is delivered from the server is a mix of HTML and data code back to the user. So in this case, instead of the backend being responsible for delivering this full HTML page, it's only responsible now for delivering the API data. Like, yes, the server will deliver your HTML templates, but the backend delivers the data, and that's the most important part. The HTML code is static. That means that you design a template, and HTML will use the template with the API to give you the final result. And the front end is more dynamic and structured. So, enough of this theory with Angular. Let's, hold on. 1 second, sorry. So before I actually show a demo of Angular, let's talk about Express for a second. So it communicates with Mongo, we know that. And it's a REST-style transfer. And that REST-style API structure is easy for Angular to harness and to put to use. Angular in general is a model view controller framework. And what model view controller means is that the model, the data, is separate from the view, which is the HTML template, which is separate from the controller, which is the logic. It's designed for single-page applications, meaning that you don't have to refresh the page. You won't get a new page if you click on a link. Only a fragment of the page will change. It's data-driven. That means whatever you put into the page, into the scope, into the memory of the page, that will reflect in your web page. And it's a real pleasure to build applications with. Like for anyone who's built a web application with Angular before. It is a lot of fun to build with. The programming modalities that they put into play are really fun and maintainable. And there's a lot of like small amounts of code that do a lot. So how does Express communicate with Angular? Well, I've already mentioned this, that there's an API. Angular reads that, it takes the data, puts it into its memory, and then the template interacts with that data and updates the page. So now let's see a demo of this in action. So all right, so I'm going to erase this HTML file. We're going to start off with a basic empty HTML page. And let's test to see that this works. So now we have hello world on our page, right? There's nothing really going on in this page. Let's say that I wanted to make world a variable so that whatever world is, if I change that variable, world will update, right? So if you're using something like PHP, you would do something like PHP echo title, right? If you were using something like Ruby, you would do something like this. If you're using other ones, they would have a similar sort of embedding system. But for the sake of this, let's use this. And that's title, right? So where am I defining title? This is a characteristic that doesn't exist in browsers right now. So we need a framework that allows you to have dynamic portions in the HTML that update when the data updates. And this is where Angular comes into play. So if I look at this page right now, you can see that that title didn't get rendered, right? So let's add a script tag. And let's reference Angular. And now let's actually define what that title is. So we're just going to put title equals Matias. And now we just had ng app, which turns on the application and makes it an Angular app. So you saw that Angular took that expression and it made it a variable. And now that variable, the title variable, is a part of the web page's scope, which is the memory of the web page. All right, so now let's make it so we can interact with that title variable. So let's say we pass in title as a name. Now this doesn't do anything yet. Right? If I start typing in, nothing happens. So we add this thing called ngModel, which is a data binding, which has the data in the memory bound to the page, which is the title attribute. And when you modify the title will update on the page. And if you modify that title in the memory, it'll update in the input field. So watch what happens now. So this is a binding system that's put into play very easily. We've only used 10 lines of code to make something that would easily be 20 lines of code in JavaScript. Okay, well, let's extend this a little bit more then. Let's say that we want to have a listing of numbers, right? So number in numbers, and we want to show what the numbers are. And let's initialize the numbers as an array of numbers from 0 to 9. And let's remove the input field for a second. So now we have our numbers listed. So this component called ng, all these things that you see here that are called ng, those are Angular's components. They're called directives. What these do is they extend the behavior of HTML to allow you to make your web page more dynamic. So we used ng repeats, and that repeated the div X amount of times depending on what items were on the list that it's iterating over. Let's extend this and add that input field. Let's call it search. And now we can filter numbers based on the search. So you see how I'm typing in values and they're getting filtered? So far we've added this interactive portion to our application where we can modify data very easily. And we're still only at 12 lines of code. Okay, so let's add some visual aspects to our code. Let's give this a repeater. And now let's add another module, which is a part of the Angular core called Angular Animate. And let's define a module in our JavaScript code. It's called app, and that will use the ng-animate module. All right, so far we're not doing anything. We're not doing any animations. Let's actually apply some animations to this. So for our base class, we're going to give it a transition, 0.5 seconds, linear all. Normally you don't need a vendor prefix, but older versions of Safari and Chrome do need them. So we're going to start with an opacity of 0, and we're going to animate to opacity. I'm a big fan of live coding. Okay, so anyways, right there we've coded 2 animation events, like one for the entering, one for the leaving of the page. Let's see how that looks. Oh, and one last thing, we need to reference the app that we created in the title of the page. You can see how these animations already come into play. So before I continue, I'm just going to add one small cool thing to our animations. And sometimes when you have an animation, people might not notice it right away because they all kind of show up at the same time. So we can add a stagger animation, which will space out all the animations one by one. So we have enter stagger, and this will have a 10 millisecond delay in between. And we have to set the duration to 0. Okay, maybe space this out a little bit more. Let's see. There's a cool feature of Angular. Anyways, that's my intro for Angular, so let's continue with what we have here. So what are the key features of Angular? Well, we have two-way data binding, and that was what I did with the input field, and the title, and then having the search. And we have modules and dependency injection. Modules, we just created a module, and everything that you create in your Angular code is housed inside of a module, and you can reuse other modules from other plugins and other pieces of code. So dependency injection, this is a really important thing. So has anyone here ever used Java Spring? Ever used a dependency system with that? Yeah. And like you probably thought it was going to complicate at first, but then you really saw the true value of the DI system. And I'd say the biggest value of a dependency injector is how you instantiate objects. So as programmers, we've all been taught that, object-oriented programming, you have a class, and then a class has another class and its parameters, and instantiates it. So the problem with this is that, let's say that you have 5 classes and you're instantiating one after the other. That order of instantiating classes, that's fixed code. If, that order changes, your code will break. So what a DI does is it's like, I need an instance of this object, or I need an instance of that object. And it does its own code to give you that instance. So if you look back at our Angular code, we haven't actually used the DI yet, because we're going to, instead of having these numbers in the page, let's make a controller, and we'll call this controller numbers, controller. And we're passing in some value called scope. And we're going to pass numbers into the scope. We're going to call this thing a numbers controller, right? So when I was using ng-init, that was just a demo. So everything that you want to do with data in your code, you want to put into a controller. So we have the numbers controller. Oh, thank you. Yes, and remove this part. So you see how I put this variable called $scope, and that's in the function name, or the function parameters. But this is a dependency injection. $scope is an Angular service. That's the memory of the application. But I'm asking for it. I'm like, give me an instance of scope. And this is what it means by DI. So as we go further with this demo, you'll see why it's useful. And that was the biggest barrier for me to understand Angular, but once I got that, it made my code much cleaner and easier to use. Finally, we talked about MVC. There's a nice system of form validations and deep linking. By deep linking, I mean routing, where you can have one URL that references a specific aspect of your page. We took a look at animations and unit integration testing. So this is the code that we had before for the index page. I have it here in the slides, so if anyone's looking for the slides, they don't have to look at the demo code. The basic interactivity with the two-way binding and the title, in this case, is just my name. With the modules, so here we have a super module, and we have two other modules that are getting loaded as dependencies for that module. And then you attach the top-level module into your page into an attribute, an HTML element using ng-app. So with modules, you can create services, which are bodies of code that can be reused within the application. So let's say that here, for example, we create a factory called numbers. And instead of the numbers just being an array that's bound in the controller, we can just inject the numbers and automatically figure out the dependency between those two. So that's what a service is. It's a body of code that you can inject into other controllers and other components of your Angular application. So back to the scope for a second then. Scope is the memory of the application. So what's happening with the code above? We have the app controller, and the app controller has these two values that we're attaching to the scope, the total apples, and we have a function called more apples that when it's called, it's going to increment that number of apples. And then this app controller is exposed in our HTML code. And we have a button that when clicked will increment the apples. So one thing that kind of I didn't like with Angular when I started using it, and I was like, okay, we have ng-click. I remember with old HTML and like old JavaScript code, you would have on-click in your HTML. I'm like, I think we're going backwards. But the idea here isn't to handle some JavaScript code that handles the click operation. It's to handle the logic. When you click on this, you want to increment the apples. You don't want to do some crazy DOM stuff. So keep that in mind that Angular tries to abstract as many of the user interaction events into their own directives. So when you have a scope on a page, which is the memory of the page, wherever you put the ng-app, that acts as the top-level memory space. So whatever you put in there will be available to every portion of the Angular code. And then inner controllers in the page have their own scope. So if you think of the DOM tree, there's the HTML attribute, HTML element. Then you have the body element. If you put something in body, then it won't be in the HTML portion. But if you put something in the HTML portion, the body can read it using the parent controller, or parent DOM node. Kind of a similar idea. We took a look at ng-repeat with the numbers. In this case, we have colors that are getting repeated. And if you look at the HTML code below, we have an ng-if. And an ng-if is basically, if this is true, show this div element. So right here we have too many colors. If too many colors is true, then show it. ng-include, we didn't look at this yet, but this is a highly usable directive in Angular where whatever you pass into the ng-include value, that will get downloaded and rendered within the div. So it's kind of like an iframe. But an iframe is like its own web page inside of a web page. This is just a body of HTML code that's downloaded and put into the page. Show and hide, same idea as ng-if. If it's true, it's going to show it. If it's true, if ng-hide is true, it's going to hide it. If ng-show is true, it's going to show it. All right, so let's continue that code. And let's add some more parts to it. So we're going to add routing to our application, right? So let's add ng-route as a dependency. And let's add our routing using the config block. So the config block in a module is the body of code that gets configured before the application is actually running. So in here, you're going to be defining your routes for the page. Okay, so we defined two routes. We have one at the root of the address, which goes to the home page, and it loads the home.html template file. And another one that goes to the new page, which loads a template file called page.html. And they're both governed by their own controllers. We have a home controller and we have a page controller. So let's quickly make a home controller. Oops. And let's quickly make a page controller. So here, let's say home equals the title. And the page, we say page equals the title, right? So now up here, let's just make two links. Let's put this one into the home. We have our repeater from before. So in here, I'm just going to have two links. The one's going to point to the home page, and another one's going to point to the other page, the new page. So you notice that I have a hash symbol in front of the URL. And Angular allows you to have two different types of routing. You can either have an HTML5 history routing, where it's just like a natural URL, or you can have a hash prefixed URL. And I'll get to setting that up in a minute. So in this case, the home and the new page have those routes in place. We also need to add in a div ngView, which will render the inner template in the page depending on the route. Let's see what that looks like. So you see how the pages are changing with that routing mechanism in place? And you see how on the home page, how it has a list of numbers getting rendered? So those are the basics of routing in AngularJS. So let's extend this just a little bit. Instead of having the numbers as data directly on the page, let's download the data from a JSON resource. So notice how we're injecting HTTP. So $HTTP is the Angular sort of XHR wrapper that allows you to download data from a JSON resource. And here we're just going to go to numbers.json. We're just going to return that. And for here, for the numbers, so we have to make this a function. I've almost done all my live coding, so don't worry about that. All right, so what we're doing here is we're downloading data from our numbers.json file. And if you look at the numbers.json file, it's just similar to what we had before. So how is this working? Like, typically when you have an asynchronous process in JavaScript, you would have a callback. Like with the Node presentation, you guys saw callbacks. And with the Express presentation, you saw callbacks that are performed on the requests that are published on the API. Angular makes use of something called promises. And promises are basically callbacks, but they're facilitated with an object instead of a function that you call. And you can pass this object around, and you can trigger the callback being called wherever you want it to. So with this code up here, it's returning a promise that when the data is actually downloaded, it's going to trigger that promise, which is triggered on the success portion of the code. Typically, promises in Angular use a then clause, but success is an extra method for the HTTP code. So our code is back to what it was before. We update the JSON resource. You can see that it updates. So here's the code for the controller and the template. That's how you define a controller. You inject scope. That's how you define routing for the controllers. So I don't mean to be flying through these slides quickly, but like we did have the demo for that, and these slides are just available if you want to look at them after. And we had to set up the ngView element to display the HTML code on the page. And here is our code to download stuff from an HTTP server. So once again, we're using the http.get. This one is doing another example using the colors. So in addition to HTTP, there's also another service called $resource. $resource is available in an Angular module called ngResource. It's another Angular file. And that allows you to do REST-specific calls from a REST server. So with our Express code, we can easily set up a resource that does that. The reason why I didn't include it in the demo is because there are other good RESTful JavaScript wrappers for Angular. So you don't have to use $resource. There's something called RESTangular, for example, that takes a different approach to querying RESTful services. We talked about animations. So in order to make animations run, we had to use the ng-animate module into our page. And for CSS animations, we had the two states. We have the enter and the leave states. And in this case, this would have been the code for our view. So I could copy this code, and I could put that into my demo, and that would work for the ng view element. If you wanted to do JavaScript animations using Angular, you just need to, in your application code, just where we define a controller, you can do a dot animation, and you can define an animation for a specific CSS class. And in there, we have the enter and we have the leave states. The important thing here is to remember to call the done method when the animation is ready. Okay, so enough live coding, enough theory. Let's take a look at an actual Angular application that has some data. So as I was preparing for this, I was just randomly typing stuff into my REST API as a series of articles. So let's take a look at what happens. So if I type in, mean article, I type in 1, 2, 3, I submit. So mean article came to the top. We see 1, 2, 3, right? So how does this work? Well, we have two parts of this website. We have the back end, which is the Express code, and we have the front end, which is the Angular code. The Express code is written as a general Express API. So if we take a look at the HTTP requests that are happening behind the scenes, you can see that this is the show page for an article. And when we go to this URL, localhost articles, the article ID, we get back a JSON blob of data. If we go to the articles page, we get back all the articles. And then the API URL for that one was just /articles. The point of this is that the API server is on a different server than the website that's being hosted. And I'll talk about this in a minute to tell you what the benefits are of hosting your API separate from your Angular code. Let's quickly take a look at the code that's involved here for a second. So in this code, we basically have three controllers. We have a home controller, form controller, and a show controller. We have these things called constants, which are constant values in Angular, values that will never change. So we have our path to our templates, and we have a path to the API. Then we've defined some filters. And filters, we saw when we typed in values into the repeater list, that's what a filter is. So in addition to having a filter based on what you typed, you can have filters for even and odd values and so on. But I'm not going to talk about that. Let's focus on the controllers. So what's happening in the home controller? It's downloading the articles from the API and it's putting it on the scope. What's happening in the show controller? The same thing's happening, but it's using the route params to figure out the ID that's in the URL, and it's downloading that article with that ID and putting it into the page. Form controller, what's happening here? This is where things get interesting. So we have a submit function. This submit function is called when the form is submitted. Just like with an ng click, when you click on a button, it would call a scope function. You can have it so that when you call a submit on a form, it will call a scope function as well. In this case, we're checking to see if the form is valid, and if it is valid, we're going to post that to our REST server. So let's take a look at the HTML code. And let me quickly remove these additional code. So what's happening here? So we have a create new article page with a title and content. this is what a simple form looks like in HTML, right? Notice up here how we have this ng-submit attribute. So ng-submit, when that is called, it's going to submit the page. And that happens, with just a simple submit button. But we also have form validations. And I put the no validate flag on the form so that the validations won't show up by the browser. So we're going to implement our own validations. In here, we have the ng model, which refers to the data. So we're setting the title on the article, and we're setting the content on the article. But we can also set these error messages that show up, depending if the data is not there. So notice how we have, if it's been submitted already, and the title has an error, required error on the page, then show this message right here. You have not entered your title, and the same for the content value. So if we go to the new article page, and I hit enter, you can see those error messages show up. So once again, the error messages are handled 100% by the template. All that the controller is doing is checking if the form is valid. So the code is, at the end of the slides, there's a link to the code if you want to download it. Those are the steps that you have to run to get the demo repo to work. So now let's actually start talking about how to structure your application. I'm not going to go too much into detail about how to set everything up. I just want to point out two different ways of how to host your code. So when I say 90% of your application, I mean that chances are that you may be working for a company and the company is like, okay, we want to upgrade our existing infrastructure to use Angular. And if you're lucky enough, you'll start out with a completely blank website. But if you're starting out with a web page that uses old code, you don't want to make it so that you kind of put yourself in a corner where you can't use anything other than Angular because your web page has been set up that way. What you can do is you can have the index page or the Angular page run as Angular, but then when you want to use your framework's HTML rendering capabilities, you can just redirect to another page. This is kind of what I mean, and there's nothing wrong with doing this, basically. So how should you structure your API? If you noticed in my coding that all the API results that I returned, they're just the data. We didn't have too much extra data around it, so you want to keep your data responses as simple as possible. Because if you have an iPhone, for example, and iPhone's interacting with your page, that may not be using Angular, and when that happens, then if your API is simple, it's going to be very easy to integrate with it. However, with the next presentation that's coming up, Gary's going to talk about authentication authorization. He's going to talk about Angular transformers, where you can transform the data that comes from the API before it's served to other parts of the application. All right, so how can you set up your Angular code? If you notice my presentation, how I had the front-end code and the back-end code as two separate directories. This means that the API, the back-end, is running on its own server, and the front-end code is running on its own server as well, and they communicate with each other. This is the ideal way to set up your Angular application, because you can manage both areas independently. If you have a team working on the API versus a team working on the front end, they don't really have to even communicate with each other in terms of code. You don't have to have your API code delivering special JavaScript code to the front end. All they have to communicate over is the API. So what's good about this setup? Well, the good thing is that the code is completely isolated. It's very easy to test because you're only testing the API versus only testing the front end. And the biggest benefit is that you can cache all of the HTML code. All of the Angular code can be cached on a CDN. So, for example, CloudFront, Amazon, what you can do is you can put all the Angular code into an S3 bucket and put it into CloudFront, and it will propagate all around the world, and it will be very fast and easy to use. What's bad about this approach? Well, the tricky part is that both the API and the www are on different domains, so you have to set up a core system so that the data can be passed back and forth. Authentication is kind of hard because your API is responsible for all the authentication, and it has to communicate that to the front end. So you end up having this custom code for your custom authentication system. And it's not wrong or it's not hard to do, it's just more code than, if you could get around, if you set up your website another way, you might not have to do that. Finally, the back end and front end, syncing that is very hard. So let's say that your API updates, and there's a breaking change in the Angular code, and how does your front end know about that? So like, let's say you leave a web page open for a week, and it's changed. So you're going to have some sort of versioning to communicate to the front end to let it update. So there's another scenario, which is the half and half approach, where you take all of the Angular code and you just put that into the public directory of Express's server. And that way you can communicate on the same domain, and then you can still have dynamic portions of your application. So for example, if you had some authorization-related tokens or a username, you could display that in the index.html file, and Angular could read that. So to set that up, you would set up your URLs in this case where you have a /API. The index page would be the Angular page, and then you can still make use of dynamic pages in your application. And then you'd use the simple hash symbol for Angular. So once again, these are all the good benefits of using that approach. But the downside of this is that you can't cache any of the HTML code on a CDN, because all the HTML code is on the same domain, which is on Express. You could probably go into the Angular core code and like tweak this around, but it's not easy. Finally, if you're not happy with your backend, if you want to switch to something else, then you can't just replace the API, because there'll be dynamic portions in your Angular code. And testing is more complicated. So I didn't go into testing with this article, but there is a video on my blog that I talked about testing for 40 minutes and gave all the ins and outs of testing. So please view that. If you guys want to read up more about Angular, so sorry, those labels didn't work with that, but egghead.io and NG newsletter are very good. And here are the links to the code and the slides for this talk. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you so much for being here and coming to this event, and it was great talking with everybody. Any questions? So the question was that taking a look at the 50-50 split versus the completely isolated split, which is the correct way of doing it? The first way is the more correct way of doing it. But it limits you in a few ways, but it's the most maintainable solution. It's generally in programming, the more isolation you have between bits of code, the better off you are. And it's a golden rule for anything. Sometimes it's tricky, and sometimes it doesn't make sense doing it that way. But that's the approach you want to take, 50-50. Or sorry, completely isolated. Any further questions? So the question was, do I prefer to use REST Angular versus dollar resource to consume API results? I've used REST Angular. I'm using it on a project. The API is a little tricky because it's kind of like you access one route, like API result. Let's say you go to articles, and then you say, I want to get the ID, so it goes to articles 1. And then you say, I want to get the comments for the article, go to articles 2. So it's kind of Rails inspired with the routing system. And that, if you don't do that properly, if you don't read the API properly for that, it can get confusing, and you'll have a lot of duplication in your code. Depending on the API that's made for, designed for you, let's say that you use Rails, right? And Rails generated this API, like credified everything. And it gave you these results in this organized URL fashion. I would use something like REST Angular because they can easily adapt to that URL structure. Any other questions? Okay, thank you everybody.